The expert. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. The photograph Professor Margaret Whitmore adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and leaned closer to the antique photograph spread across her mahogany desk. The sepia-toned image, dated 1959, showed three children playing in what appeared to be a garden in Salem, Massachusetts. The photograph had arrived that morning via courier, accompanied by a letter from the estate of recently deceased collector Harold Pemberton. The children in the photograph were captured mid-play, their faces bright with innocent joy. A girl of perhaps 8 years old held a wooden hoop, while two boys, slightly older, appeared to be engaged in some sort of chase game. Behind them, the blurred outline of Salem's historic architecture provided a haunting backdrop. Margaret had built a reputation as one of the foremost experts in paranormal photography, spending the better part of 2 decades analyzing supposedly supernatural images for universities, museums, and private collectors. Most proved to be elaborate hoaxes or simple photographic anomalies. This particular image, however, had already begun to intrigue her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The accompanying letter from Pemberton's estate was brief but compelling. Professor Whitmore, my grandfather left specific instructions that this photograph should be examined by someone of your expertise upon his death. He claimed it contained something extraordinary that could only be seen when one looked closely enough. We hope you can shed light on what he meant. Margaret picked up her magnifying glass, a tool that had served her well throughout her career. As she moved it slowly across the photograph's surface, she noticed the exceptional clarity of the image, despite its age. The photographer had possessed considerable skill, capturing not just the children but the intricate details of their clothing, the texture of the garden stone pathway, and even individual leaves on the trees that framed the scene. The children themselves seemed frozen in a moment of pure happiness. The girl's dress was pristine white with delicate lace trim, while the boys wore matching sailor suits that spoke to the fashion of the early. Their faces were turned toward the camera, as if the photographer had called out to them just before capturing the shot. As Margaret continued her examination, she felt an odd sensation, as though the photograph was drawing her deeper into its work. The longer she stared, the more she could almost hear the echo of children's laughter, smell the scent of autumn leaves, and feel the crisp New England air of that long ago day. Her office, usually a sanctuary of academic calm, seemed to grow quieter as the afternoon wore on. The familiar sounds of the university campus outside her window faded into background noise as she became increasingly absorbed in her work. There was something about this photograph that set it apart from the hundreds of others she had examined over the years. Margaret made careful notes in her leather-bound journal, documenting every detail she observed. The quality of the photographic paper, the composition of the image, the lighting conditions that would have been present during the shoot. All of it pointed to a legitimate photograph from the stated time period. There were no obvious signs of manipulation or double exposure, techniques commonly used in the early 1900s to create spirit photographs for gullible customers. As the day drew to a close, Margaret carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve and locked it in her desk drawer. Tomorrow, she would begin a more thorough analysis using the advanced equipment available in the university's photography lab. But even as she gathered her things to leave, she found herself reluctant to put the image away. There was something about those three children that called to her, something that suggested their story was far from over. As she walked across the campus toward her car, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she had just begun a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the boundary between the living and the dead. The laboratory. The next morning found Margaret in the university's state-of-the-art photography laboratory, surrounded by equipment that would have seemed like magic to the photographer who had captured that Salem scene over a century ago. Digital scanners, computer monitors, and specialized lighting equipment filled the starry white room, a stark contrast to the warm, sepia world contained within the photograph. Dr. James Chen, the lab's director and Margaret's longtime colleague, had agreed to assist with the analysis. His expertise in digital enhancement and photographic forensics had proven invaluable in previous investigations, and Margaret trusted his scientific approach to balance her more intuitive methods. "This is remarkable work for 19 Sim observed as he carefully positioned the photograph under the high-resolution scanner. "The depth of field, the composition, whoever took this was a true artist." Margaret nodded, watching as the scanner's light bar moved slowly across the image, capturing every minute detail in digital form. The Pemberton letter mentioned that the original photographer was someone named Ezra Blackwood. "He did some preliminary research last night. He was apparently quite renowned in Salem during that period, though he disappeared mysteriously in..." The scanning process took nearly an hour, with James adjusting settings to capture the photograph at various resolutions and light spectrums. When they finally had the digital files, Margaret felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. This was where the real work would begin. "Let's start with basic enhancement," James suggested, pulling up the image on his computer screen. "We'll increase the contrast and adjust the brightness levels to see if anything becomes more visible." As James worked his digital magic, Margaret found herself studying the children's faces more closely than ever before. The girl's expression held a hint of mischief, as though she was about to burst into laughter. The older boy appeared to be reaching for something just outside the frame, while the younger one looked directly at the camera with startling intensity. "There," James said, stepping back from the monitor. "That's about as clear as we can make it without losing the image integrity." Margaret leaned forward, her breath catching slightly. The enhanced image revealed details that had been invisible to the naked eye. The texture of the children's clothing was now crisp enough to count individual threads. The garden around them showed signs of careful tending, with precisely trimmed hedges and carefully arranged flower beds. But it was something else that caught her attention, a shadow in the background that didn't seem to match any visible object. "James, can you zoom in on that area behind the children? There, near the garden gate." James manipulated the image, enlarging the section Margaret had indicated. As the pixels expanded and the computer's algorithms worked to maintain clarity, both the researchers fell silent. What they saw defied easy explanation. Partially obscured by the garden's foliage, but now clearly visible thanks to the digital enhancement, was the unmistakable outline of a fourth figure. Unlike the sharp, clear images of the three children, this figure appeared translucent, as though it existed somewhere between the physical world and something else entirely. "That's impossible," James whispered, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "There's no way. This could be a double exposure or photographic trick. The lighting is all wrong for that, and the figure appears to be interacting with the environment in real time." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. In all her years of investigating paranormal photography, she had never encountered anything quite like this. The figure appeared to be that of a woman, dressed in clothing that seemed to predate even. Her face was turned toward the children, and there was something in her posture that suggested both longing and profound sadness. "Can you enhance it further?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James worked for another hour, using every tool at his disposal to clarify the mysterious figure. With each adjustment, more details emerged. The woman's dress appeared to be from the mid-1800s, with a high collar and long sleeves that spoke to an earlier era of fashion. Her hair was pulled back in a severe style, and her hands seemed to be reaching toward the playing children. But it was her eyes that truly unsettled Margaret. Even through the digital enhancement, even across more than a century of time, those eyes held an expression of such intense emotion that it was almost painful to witness. There was love there, and loss, and something that might have been hope. "We need to research the history of this location," Margaret said finally, stepping back from the monitor. "If this figure is what I think it might be, then this photograph has captured something extraordinary." James saved their work and carefully returned the original photograph to its protective sleeve. As they prepared to leave the lab, Both researchers found themselves glancing back at the computer screen, where the enhanced image still glowed with its impossible secret. Neither spoke of the chill that had settled over the room during their work, or the way the laboratory's fluorescent lights had seemed to flicker whenever they focused on the mysterious fourth figure. Some things, they both understood, were better left unspoken until they could be better understood. Salem Secrets Margaret spent the following week immersed in research, diving deep into Salem's historical records with the determination of a detective pursuing a cold case. The Salem Historical Society's archives became her second home, and the librarians grew accustomed to seeing her hunched over microfilm readers and dusty ledgers, searching for any trace of the children in the photograph or the mysterious woman who seemed to watch over them. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when Margaret discovered a newspaper clipping from the Salem Evening News, dated October 20th. The accompanying article, though brief, sent chills down Margaret's spine. According to the report, 3 children, Emma Hartwell, age 8, and brothers Thomas and William Morrison, ages 10 and 9 respectively, had disappeared while playing in the garden behind the former Blackwood estate. The children had been seen that morning by several neighbors, but when they failed to return home for dinner, a search was organized. Despite extensive efforts by local authorities and volunteers, no trace of the children was ever found. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she read the names: Emma, Thomas, and William. Sent 3 children who smiled back at her from the 1905 photograph. But if they had disappeared, how had Ezra Blackwood managed to photograph them? And more importantly, what had happened to them? Further research revealed that the Blackwood estate had a dark history stretching back to the Salem witch trials of 332. The property had originally belonged to Mercy Blackwood, a young woman accused of witchcraft and executed during the height of the hysteria. According to trial records, Mercy had been condemned largely on the testimony of several local children who claimed she had tried to lure them into her garden with promises of sweets and toys. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Margaret discovered that Mercy Blackwood had been only 23 when she was hanged, and that she had been known for her love of children despite having none of her own. Witnesses at her trial had described her as a gentle soul who often cared for neighborhood children when their parents were working. As Margaret delved deeper into the records, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades since Mercy's execution, children had gone missing in the vicinity of the old Blackwood property. The disappearances were sporadic and often separated by years, but they shared common elements. The children were always playing alone, or in small groups. They were last seen near the garden, and they simply vanished without a trace. The most recent case, before Emma, Thomas and William, had occurred in 1978, when 2 young sisters had disappeared while picking flowers near the estate's crumbling walls. Before that, a boy had vanished in 19. Each case had baffled local authorities and left families devastated, but no connection had ever been made to the property's dark past. Margaret also uncovered information about Ezra Blackwood, the photographer who had captured the impossible image. He was Mercy's great-nephew, a descendant who had inherited the property in 1903 and had attempted to restore both the house and garden to their former glory. Neighbors described him as an eccentric but talented artist who was obsessed with documenting what he called the lingering echoes of the past. According to the records, Ezra had disappeared in early 1906, just months after the 3 children had vanished. His camera equipment was found in the garden, but he was never seen again. The property was eventually sold by distant relatives and later demolished to make way for a small park. As Margaret compiled her research, she began to form a theory that challenged everything she thought she knew about the supernatural. What if the photograph hadn't captured ghosts in the traditional sense, but rather some kind of temporal echo, a moment when the past and present had somehow overlapped? The woman in the enhanced image Margaret now believed was Mercy Blackwood herself. Somehow, across the centuries, she was still connected to that garden, still reaching out to the children who played there. But whether she was trying to protect them or was somehow responsible for their disappearances remained a terrifying question. Margaret and the researchers had provided answers, but they only led to more disturbing questions. As she sat in her office that evening, staring at the photograph that had started it all, she realized that her investigation was far from... If anything, she was just beginning to understand the true scope of the mystery that had been hidden in plain sight for more than a century. The three children in the photograph smiled back at her, frozen in their moment of innocent play, unaware that they were about to become part of Salem's darkest legacy. And behind them, barely visible but undeniably present, Mercy Blackwood continued her eternal vigil, her eyes holding secrets that Margaret was only beginning to comprehend. And look, the most striking part is still to come. But if this has made sense to you so far, like the video and send it to someone who needs to hear this. The expert's dilemma. Margaret's discovery had placed her in an unprecedented position. As a respected academic, she was bound by scientific rigor and peer review. Yet, the evidence before her suggested something that challenged the very foundations of rational thought. She found herself caught between her professional reputation and what appeared to be an extraordinary supernatural phenomenon. Elizabeth Hawthorne, the department head and Margaret's mentor, listened with growing concern as Margaret presented her findings. The older woman's office, lined with academic awards and scholarly publications, seemed to shrink as Margaret laid out the photographs, research documents, and digital enhancements that told the impossible story of the missing children. Margaret, you understand what you're suggesting here, Dr. Hawthorne said carefully. Her fingers steepled as she studied the evidence. You're asking me to believe that this photograph has captured some kind of supernatural event, and that it's connected to disappearances spanning centuries. Margaret nodded, knowing how it sounded. I understand the implications, Elizabeth, but look at the evidence. The digital enhancement clearly shows a fourth figure that wasn't visible in the original photograph. The historical records confirmed that these three children disappeared on the same day this photograph was supposedly taken. And the pattern of disappearances connected to this location goes back to the witch trials. Dr. Hawthorne picked up the enhanced photograph, studying it through her reading glasses. Margaret watched her mentor's expression change as she examined the translucent figure of Mercy Blackwood, noting the way the older woman's breath caught when she saw the woman's reaching hands and sorrowful eyes. Even if I accept that this image shows something, Hawthorne said slowly, what exactly are you proposing to do with this information? You can't publish a paper claiming to have discovered proof of ghosts. The academic community would destroy your career. It was a valid concern, and one that had kept Margaret awake for several nights. Her reputation as a serious researcher was built on decades of debunking fraudulent paranormal claims. To now present evidence supporting the supernatural would be professional suicide, regardless of how compelling that evidence might be. I'm not sure yet, Margaret admitted, but I feel responsible for these children somehow. If there's even a chance that understanding what happened to them could prevent future disappearances, don't I have an obligation to pursue it? Dr. Hawthorne set down the photograph and leaned back in her chair. Margaret, you're talking about children who disappeared over a century ago. Even if your theory is correct, what could you possibly do about it now? Before Margaret could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. As she glanced at the screen, her blood ran cold. The message was from James Chen in the photography lab. You need to come here immediately. The photograph has changed. Margaret showed the message to Dr. Hawthorne, whose skeptical expression shifted to one of concern. Together they hurried across campus to the photography lab, where they found James staring at his computer monitor with a mixture of fascination and fear. I was running additional analysis on the digital files, James explained, as they approached. He wanted to see if I could enhance the background figure even further. But when I opened the file, It was different. On the screen, the photograph appeared exactly as it had before, with one crucial exception. The three children, who had been captured mid-play in the original image, were now looking directly at the camera. Their expressions had changed from joyful innocence to something that might have been pleading or warning. "That's impossible," Hodden whispered, her scientific worldview crumbling as she stared at the altered image. "Digital files don't change on their own." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lab's air conditioning. "James, do you have the original scan files? Can you compare them?" James pulled up the earlier files, and the three academics watched in stunned silence as the comparison revealed the undeniable truth. The photograph had indeed changed. The children's positions were slightly different, their faces turned toward the camera with expressions that seemed to transcend time itself. "There's something else," James said quietly. "Look at the background figure." Margaret leaned closer to the monitor. Mercy Blackwood's translucent form was now more visible than before, and her reaching hands seemed to be moving toward the children with greater urgency. But it was her face that truly unsettled Margaret. Where before there had been sadness and longing, now there was something that looked distinctly like warning. "We need to contact the current owners of that property," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "If this photograph is some activity, if it is trying to communicate signature sending, then there might be immediate danger." Dr. Hawthorne, her academic skepticism overwhelmed by the evidence before her, nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls. We need to find out who owns that land now and whether there have been any recent incidents." As the three researchers stood in the lab, staring at a photograph that defied every law of physics and logic they had ever studied, Margaret realized that her investigation had entered entirely new territory. She was no longer just studying a historical mystery, she was potentially witnessing a supernatural warning that could have life or death implications for someone in the present day. The children in the photograph continued to stare out at them, their century-old eyes holding secrets that Margaret was only beginning to understand. And behind them, Mercy Blackwood's ghostly form seemed to pulse with an urgency that suggested time was running out. Present danger. Hawthorne's contacts in the Salem City Planning Office revealed that the former Blackwood estate was now the site of Willowbrook Elementary School, built in 1987 on the exact location where the garden had once flourished. The school served nearly 300 children between the ages of 5 and 11, the same age range as every child who had disappeared over the centuries. Margaret felt her stomach drop as she absorbed this information. If their photograph was indeed trying to warn them of impending danger, then hundreds of innocent children were potentially at risk. She immediately called the school's principal, Dr. Sarah Martinez, and requested an urgent meeting. "I understand your concern, Professor Whitmore," Martinez said as she led Margaret through the school's cheerful hallways the next morning. "But I have to say, your theory sounds rather unusual. We've never had any problems here. The children love playing in our garden area during recess." Margaret tried to maintain her professional composure as they walked past colorful bulletin boards and children's artwork. The normalcy of the school environment seemed to mock the supernatural urgency she felt. How could she explain that a century-old photograph was somehow warning of danger without sounding completely unhinged? "Could you show me the garden area?" Margaret asked. "I'd like to see exactly where the children play." Martinez led her outside to a beautifully maintained playground and garden area. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the layout from her historical research. Though the original Blackwood house was long gone, the basic geography remained the same. The old stone walls that had bordered Mercy's garden still stood, now incorporated into the school's landscaping design. "This is where our students spend most of their outdoor time," Dr. Martinez explained, gesturing toward the play area. "We've never had any safety issues, and the children absolutely love it here. In fact, some of them seem almost drawn to this particular spot." Margaret felt a chill at those words. What do you mean, drawn to it? Oh, it's probably nothing, Dr. Martinez said with a laugh. But some of the teachers have mentioned that certain children seem to gravitate toward that corner of the garden, near the old stone wall. They'll play there for hours if we let them, almost as if they're playing with invisible friends. The principal's casual words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Children playing with invisible friends near the exact spot where Mercy Blackwood had once tended her garden, where 3 children had disappeared in 1905, where a pattern of vanishings had occurred for over 2 centuries. Martinez, I need you to consider temporarily restricting access to that area, Margaret said urgently. I know it sounds extreme, but I have reason to believe there might be some kind of danger associated with that location. The principal's expression shifted from polite interest to concern. Professor Whitmore, I can't restrict children's access to our playground. Based on what exactly? A theory about a historical photograph. Before Margaret could respond, a commotion erupted from the garden area. A teacher was calling out, her voice tinged with panic. Has anyone seen Emma? She was just here a moment ago. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Emma, the same name as the little girl who had disappeared in 1905. She rushed toward the garden with Dr. Martinez close behind, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. They found the teacher, Mrs. Patterson, standing near the old stone wall with a group of confused first graders. She was playing right here with the other children, Mrs. Patterson explained, her voice shaking. He turned away for just a moment to help another student, and when I looked back, she was gone. Emma Thompson, Dr. Martinez called out, hoping the child was simply hiding nearby. Emma, if you can hear me, please come out. You're not in trouble. Margaret approached the spot where the child had last been seen. The area was surrounded by the old stone walls, with several large trees providing shade and concealment. As she examined the ground, she noticed something that made her heart race, small footprints in the soft earth, leading directly toward the wall and then simply stopping. We need to call the police, Margaret said, pulling out her phone, and we need to evacuate this area immediately. Dr. Martinez began organizing the other children, moving them away from the garden while teachers conducted a thorough search of the school grounds. Margaret called James Chen and tasked him to check the photograph again, though she dreaded what he might find. 20 minutes later, James called back with news that confirmed Margaret's worst fears. The photograph has changed again, he reported, his voice tight with disbelief. There are now 4 children in the image, instead of 3. A little girl with blonde hair in a modern school uniform. She's standing with the others, but she looks confused, like she doesn't understand where she is. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility crashing down on her. Somehow the supernatural forces connected to the old Blackwood property were still active, still claiming children just as they had for centuries. And now, because she hadn't acted quickly enough on the photograph's warning, another innocent child had been taken. The police arrived within minutes, followed by search teams and emergency personnel. As Margaret watched the organized chaos of a missing child investigation unfold around her, she realized that conventional methods would not be enough to find Emma Thompson. The answer lay in understanding the connection between Mercy Blackwood, the missing children, and the impossible photograph that had started it all. Standing in the garden, where so much tragedy had occurred, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find a way to communicate directly with whatever force was behind these disappearances, even if it meant risking her own safety. The children, past and present, deserved nothing less than her complete commitment to uncovering the truth. You want to know how far this message is reaching? Comment below and tell me which city or country you're watching from. Margaret's proposal to conduct a séance was met with skepticism from law enforcement and outright opposition from Dr. Hawthorne. However, as the hours passed without any trace of Emma Thompson, desperation began to override rational objections. Dr. Martinez, faced with the unthinkable possibility of losing a student, agreed to allow Margaret to attempt contact with whatever supernatural forces might be at work. "I want to be clear," Detective Robert Sullivan said as he stood in the school's library that evening. "This is highly irregular, and I'm only allowing it because conventional search methods have yielded nothing. If this doesn't produce results, we're going back to standard procedures." Margaret nodded, understanding the detective's position. She had assembled a small team for the attempt herself. James Chen for technical documentation, Sir. Dr. Hawthorne as a witness, and surprisingly, Mrs. Patterson, the teacher who had been with Emma when she disappeared. The older woman had insisted on participating, claiming she felt responsible for the child's disappearance. They had chosen the library because it was the room in the school closest to the garden area where Emma had vanished. Margaret spent the afternoon researching historical accounts of communication with spirits, drawing on both academic sources and the practical knowledge she had gained from investigating fraudulent mediums over the years. The enhanced photograph sat in the center of the table they had arranged, its impossible image serving as a focal point for their efforts. Margaret had also brought several items from her research: copies of Mercy Blackwood's trial records, a map of the original garden layout, and a small piece of stone that had been chipped from the original wall. "I want everyone to understand what we're attempting here," Margaret said, as they took their seats around the table. "Based on my research, I believe Mercy Blackwood's spirit has been connected to this location for over 3 centuries. The pattern of disappearances suggests she's somehow drawing children to her, possibly in an attempt to find peace or resolution." Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. But why would she take them? If she loved children as much as the historical records suggest, why would she harm them? "That's what we need to find out," Margaret replied. "It's possible she doesn't realize she's harming them. Spirits often become trapped in patterns of behavior from their living years, repeating actions without understanding their consequences." James had set up several cameras and audio recording devices around the room, determined to document whatever might occur. Hawthorne sat with a notebook, ready to record any phenomena they might observe. Detective Sullivan remained standing near the door, his hand resting unconsciously on his service weapon. Margaret began the seance using techniques she had observed during her investigations of fraudulent mediums, but with genuine intent rather than deceptive purpose. She called out to Mercy Blackwood, asking her to make her presence known and to help them understand what had happened to the missing children. For nearly an hour, nothing occurred. The room remained still and silent, with only the distant sounds of the ongoing search outside to break the tension. Margaret was beginning to wonder if her theory was completely wrong when the temperature in the room suddenly dropped by at least 10 degrees. Jamie's cameras began malfunctioning simultaneously, their displays flickering between normal images and strange distorted views that seemed to show the room as it might have appeared centuries ago. The photograph in the center of the table began to glow with a soft, ethereal light that had no apparent source. "Mercy," Margaret called out, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We know you're here. We want to help you, but we need to understand. What happened to the children? What happened to Emma?" The response came not as a voice, but as a series of images that appeared directly in their minds. Margaret saw flashes of Mercy's life, a young woman tending her garden, caring for neighborhood children while their parents worked, being accused of witchcraft by those same children under pressure from hysterical adults. But the most powerful image was of Mercy's execution. Margaret felt a woman's terror and confusion as she was led to the gallows, her desperate attempts to explain that she had only tried to help the children. Her final moments filled with a love so strong it transcended death itself. "She never meant to harm them," Miss Patterson whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's been trying to protect them all these years." More images flooded their consciousness. Mercy's spirit bound to the garden by her intense love for children and her desperate need to keep them safe. Over the centuries, she had been drawing children to her realm not to harm them, but to shelter them from what she perceived as a dangerous world. In her confused spiritual state, she couldn't understand that she was actually separating them from their families and trapping them in a place between life and death. "Where are they?" Margaret asked aloud. "Where are Emma and the others?" The final image was the most startling of all. They saw the children, not just Emma and the three from 90 Salfinco, but dozens of children from across the centuries playing in a version of the garden that existed outside of normal time and space. They were safe and happy, but they were also trapped, unable to return to their own world without Mercy's permission. As the visions faded, Margaret understood what needed to be done. Mercy Blackwood wasn't evil. She was a confused and grieving spirit who had been trying to love and protect children for over 300 years. But her good intentions had created a supernatural prison that had claimed innocent lives across the centuries. "Mercy," Margaret said softly, addressing the presence she could feel in the room. "You need to let them go. You need to let them return to their families. Your love for them is beautiful, but keeping them with you is causing pain to so many people." The room grew even colder, and Margaret sensed resistance from the spirit. Mercy had been alone for so long, had found such joy in caring for the children she had gathered to her realm. The thought of releasing them and returning to solitude was almost unbearable. But as Margaret continued to speak, explaining the pain of the families who had lost their children, describing the love that awaited each child in their own time and place, she felt Mercy's resolve beginning to weaken. The spirit's love for children was genuine, and that same love would ultimately compel her to do what was right, even if it meant facing eternity alone. The return, the moment of Mercy's decision, manifested as a brilliant flash of light that filled the library, followed by a sound like wind chimes mixed with children's laughter. When Margaret's vision cleared, she saw that the photograph on the table had changed once again. Now it showed only the garden itself, empty of both living children and supernatural presences. "Look outside," James whispered, pointing toward the library windows. In the garden area, barely visible in the darkness, figures were beginning to materialize. Children of different eras, wearing clothing that spanned centuries, appeared one by one in the space where they had originally vanished. Some looked confused. Others seemed to understand instinctively that they were returning home. Detective Sullivan was already on his radio, calling for medical teams and additional officers. The search teams outside had spotted the children and were approaching cautiously, unsure of what they were witnessing, but focused on the immediate need to ensure the children's safety. Emma Thompson appeared at last, materializing near the old stone wall exactly where she had vanished earlier that day. She looked around in bewilderment, as though waking from a strange dream, before running toward the school building where Mrs. Patterson was already rushing to meet her. "Emma!" "Oh, thank God, Emma!" Mrs. Patterson cried, sweeping the little girl into her arms. "Are you hurt? Are you okay?" Emma seemed physically unharmed, but emotionally disoriented. "I was playing with the nice lady," she said in a small voice. "She had a beautiful garden, and there were lots of other children there. She said she wanted to keep us safe, but then she started crying and told us we had to go home." Margaret felt tears streaming down her own face as she watched the reunion. Through the windows, she could see other children being approached by the search teams. Some appeared to be from recent decades and would hopefully be reunited with living family members. Others, dressed in clothing from earlier eras, would require more complex handling as authorities tried to understand what had happened. The three children from 1903, Emma Hartwell, Thomas Morrison, and William Morrison, stood together near the center of the garden. They looked exactly as they had in the photograph, unchanged by the century they had spent in Mercy's realm. Margaret realized that these children, and others from earlier disappearances, would face the heartbreaking reality of returning to a world where their families were long dead. What happens to them now? Dr. Hawthorne, voicing the question that weighed on everyone's mind. Detective Sullivan was coordinating with social services and medical personnel, but it was clear that no one had protocols for dealing with children who had been missing for decades or centuries. The situation would require unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement, social services, historians, and medical professionals. Margaret approached the three children from 1905, kneeling down to their level, as she had seen Mrs. Patterson do with Emma. They looked at her with the same intelligent, curious expressions she had studied in the photograph. "Hello," she said gently. "My name is Margaret. I know this must be very confusing for you." Emma Harkwell, the little girl with the wooden hoop, stepped forward. The lady said, "You helped her understand," she said in a voice that carried the formal speech patterns of her era. She said, "You made her realize that keeping us wasn't the same as loving us." "That's right," Margaret replied. "Merci cared about all of you very much, but she was confused about what was best for you. Now you're free to make your own choices about where you want to be." Thomas Morrison, the older boy, looked around at the modern world with wide eyes. "Our families, they're gone, aren't they?" "It's been a very long time," Margaret nodded sadly. "Yes, it has been a long time, but there are people who will help you figure out what comes next. You don't have to face this alone." As the night progressed, Margaret worked with authorities to begin the complex process of integrating the returned children into the modern world. Some of the more recent disappearances could potentially be reunited with surviving family members. Others would require foster care, adoption, or specialized facilities equipped to help them adjust to a world that had changed dramatically since their disappearances. The children from the earliest disappearances presented the most challenging cases. They would need extensive support to understand and adapt to a world of technology, social changes, and cultural shifts that would seem like magic to them. Margaret found herself volunteering to help coordinate their care, feeling a deep responsibility for their welfare. As dawn broke over Salem, Margaret had stood in the garden, where so much tragedy and mystery had finally found resolution. The old stone walls remained, but the supernatural presence that had haunted this place for centuries was gone. Mercy Blackwood had finally found peace, her love for children ultimately leading her to the greatest act of love possible, letting them go. The photograph that had started it all now showed only an empty garden, but Margaret knew she would treasure it always as a reminder of the power of love to transcend even death, and the importance of understanding that sometimes the greatest kindness is knowing when to say goodbye. Legacy: 6 months after the night that would forever be known in Salem as the return, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard University, delivering what would become one of the most controversial and widely discussed lectures in the history of paranormal research. The audience included academics, journalists, government officials, and families of the returned children, all seeking to understand the implications of what had occurred. The events at Willowbrook Elementary School challenged our fundamental understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was discussing. But more importantly, they remind us that love, even misguided love, can have consequences that echo across centuries. The integration of the returned children into modern society had been a complex process that required an unprecedented cooperation between multiple agencies and organizations. Emma Thompson had recovered quickly from her brief disappearance, though she continued to speak occasionally about the nice lady with the sad eyes who had wanted to keep her safe. The children from more recent decades had faced varying degrees of difficulty adjusting to the changes in the world they had left behind. Advances in technology, shifts in social norms, and the loss of family members who had aged or died during their absence created challenges that required ongoing psychological support and specialized care. But it was the children from the earliest disappearances who had captured the world's attention and sympathy. Emma Hartwell, Thomas Morrison, and William Morrison had become symbols of resilience and hope, their ability to adapt to the modern world inspiring countless people around the globe. Margaret had worked closely with a team of specialists to help these children understand and navigate their new reality. Emma had shown a remarkable aptitude for learning, quickly mastering basic reading and writing skills that built upon her. The Morrison brothers had struggled more with the transition but had found comfort in each other and in the stable, loving environment provided by their foster families. What we learned from Mercy Blackwood, Margaret continued in her lecture, is that the supernatural world may be far more complex and emotionally driven than we previously understood. This was not a malevolent haunting in the traditional sense, but rather the manifestation of a love so powerful that it transcended death and created its own reality. The academic community remained divided on how to interpret the event. Some colleagues had embraced Margaret's findings as groundbreaking evidence of life after death, while others continued to search for rational explanations that didn't require accepting the existence of the supernatural. Margaret herself had found peace with the ambiguity, understanding that some truths were more important than academic consensus. Dr. Hawthorne, who had initially been skeptical of Margaret's theories, had become one of her strongest supporters. Together, they had established the Blackwood Foundation, a research organization dedicated to investigating similar cases and providing support for individuals affected by supernatural. The Foundation's first major project was the creation of a memorial garden at Willowbrook Elementary School, built on the exact site where Mercy Blackwood's original garden had flourished. The memorial honored both Mercy herself and all the children who had been affected by her centuries-long vigil. A plaque near the entrance read, "In memory of Mercy Blackwood and the children she loved. May we all learn to love wisely and let go gracefully." Emma Hartwell, now living with a loving adoptive family in Boston, had requested that a special section of the memorial garden be dedicated to flowers that would have grown in Mercy's time. At the age of 8, though she had lived that age for over a century, she had become an advocate for understanding and forgiveness, often speaking to groups about her experiences in what she called the in-between place. Mercy wasn't bad, Emma would tell audiences, her formal speech patterns gradually adapting to modern language. She was just lonely and scared. She thought the world was dangerous, and she wanted to keep us safe. But she learned that love means trusting people to take care of themselves, even when it's scary to let them go. The Morrison brothers had chosen to remain together, living with a family in Salem who specialized in caring for children with unique needs. Thomas had developed an interest in photography, inspired by the image that had led to their rescue, while William had shown remarkable artistic talent, creating paintings that seemed to capture glimpses of the otherworldly realm where they had spent a century. As Margaret concluded her lecture, she reflected on how the experience had changed her own understanding of life, death, and the power of human connection. The photograph that had started it all remained in her office, now showing only an empty garden, but serving as a constant reminder of the mystery and wonder that still existed in the world. The children have taught us that love transcends time, death, and then our understanding of reality itself, Margaret said to her audience. But they've also shown us that true love sometimes requires the courage to let go, to trust in the strength and resilience of those we care about, and to accept that our role as protectors has limits. In the months that followed, similar cases began to emerge from around the world. Families coming forward with stories of missing children, unexplained photographs, and supernatural phenomena that had been dismissed or ignored for generations. The Blackwood Foundation worked to investigate these cases, always with the goal of bringing resolution and healing to both the living and the dead. Margaret's work had evolved from debunking fraudulent paranormal claims to facilitating genuine supernatural healing. She had learned that the boundary between the living and the dead was far more permeable than she had ever imagined, and that love, in all its forms, was the force that most often bridged that gap. As she stood in the memorial garden one evening, watching Emma Hartwell and the Morrison brothers play with modern children who had accepted their unusual story with the remarkable adaptability of youth, Margaret felt a deep sense of completion. The mystery that had begun with a simple photograph had led to one of the most extraordinary discoveries in human history. But more importantly, it had brought peace to a tormented spirit and freedom to the children she had loved too much to release. The garden was quiet now, free of supernatural presence but filled with the laughter of children, who played there safely, watched over by living guardians who understood the delicate balance between protection and freedom. In the fading light of sunset, Margaret could almost see Mercy Blackwood's spirit, one final time, no longer reaching desperately for the children, but standing peacefully at the garden's edge, finally at rest in the knowledge that love, when expressed with wisdom and courage, could indeed conquer death itself. The expert had found her answer, and in doing so, had discovered that some mysteries were meant not just to be solved, but to transform everyone they touched. The photograph remained a testament to the power of looking closely enough to see the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to seek it out and wise enough to act upon it with compassion and understanding. In Salem, Massachusetts, where the line between history and legend had always been thin, 3 children from 1995 continued to grow and learn in the modern world, living proof that love could indeed transcend time, death, and the boundaries of human understanding. And in a small memorial garden, flowers bloomed in patterns that Mercy Blackwood would have recognized, tended by hands that understood the sacred responsibility of caring for others while knowing when to let them find their own way home.